Who's your commander?
Good luck.
Equip.
Move to combat. Resolves.
Right.
Now, before you attack
Does
me,
anyone have an answer?
well played.
Good game.
Hello everyone, DJ here. This is the Jumbo Commander YouTube channel, and I'm celebrating my 300th episode. That's a lot. I've been on the platform for a little over 4 years now. I've done videos like this before and you guys seem to really like them, so hopefully you enjoy this one. If you want to see the full deck list, head on over to my new website, jumbocommander.com, where you can take a deep dive into all my personal decks. I've been consistently collecting Magic cards for over 20 years. I have a collection at this point in time that can basically have me building almost any deck. And so the fact that I have decks that I really like means that there's something special about them, something exceptional or unique. I am always building commander decks. In fact, I will take the most upvoted commander in the comments down below and build that deck. All right, let's take a look at all of my commander decks. Oketra is a mono-white deck that centers around creatures, because whenever you play a creature when Oketra's out, you get a 4/4 zombie. Those are pretty good stats, and so this is a deck that's inherently aggressive swinging in with creatures. But they're going to be swinging in with zombies dealing damage. All my creatures are, well, dinky and disruptive. I can disrupt you playing your commander, playing out of the graveyard, enter the battlefield effects, planeswalkers, playing on other people's turns, activated abilities, your expensive mana bases, and tempoing your creatures out and searching the library. And then because mono white is really lacking on card draw and ramp, I want to make sure that I can get my spells back through recursion, like Brought Back or Sun Titan. Amiria Shepherd is really great. I have a few fetch lands in here just to be able to trigger that multiple times. And the Sky Ruin that goes along with it. I also want to make sure that my creatures don't really leave the battlefield, with Luminous Broodmoth giving them sort of a persist with flying, and then giving it indestructible or protection from the color of my choice. All right, this is my Braids Conjure Adept deck. The whole point of this deck is to play Braids and let your opponents play big creatures. You kind of hope that your creatures that you drop are a little bit bigger. It that betrays is huge, and if you annihilate your opponents and they sacrifice what they put onto the battlefield, you get it. Same thing goes with Keteric Leviathan, huge creature, but it bounces all of the creatures that they put onto the battlefield. You know, Agent of Treachery steals their creature, and then Tidespout Tyrant lets you easily bounce theirs. That's the whole point, is to sort of have answers to what they put onto the battlefield, no matter what they do, and then hopefully you have bigger things. You know, Bloodthirsty Blade just says, okay, you can have your thing, it just can't come at me. You know, Crystal Shard lets you bounce your Braids back to your hand if you find that it's being problematic, but also it can easily bounce your opponent's creatures as well, because in the early game, they're not going to have enough mana to keep it from bouncing. And Propaganda is another way of saying, yeah, just send this sort of somewhere else besides me. Similarly, Fate Spinner. You know, they can choose to skip like their draw step or their main phase, but most of the time they're skipping combat, so they're not going to be attacking you with those big creatures. And of course, we can use our own suite of creatures to bounce theirs, and these are all cheap enough that we don't have to play them with Braids. You know, Venser easily bounces theirs, Gilded Drake easily steals theirs, Fairy Artisans can make a copy of theirs. You know, we can also copy theirs with a Phantasmal Image very cheaply, or steal it with a Sower of Temptation. So if you're sending your big creatures at my opponents, then great, like you can do whatever you want. But if you send them at me, I'm going to take them, steal them, copy them, do everything to them, and in the late game, I'm going to have bigger creatures than you. Braids is one of my favorite decks. It's political, it's fun, it wins. This is my mono black enchantment Erebos deck. I have packed this full of every single one of my favorite black enchantments. The first group of enchantments kind of mess with creatures. We have Spreading Plague, which can keep the board clean, Tainted Ether, The Abyss, No Mercy, Revel in Riches, Oubliette and Nether Void. All of these can really disrupt your opponent's ability to stick things on the board. And then there's more taxation, where I just make sure to slowly drain them out. Palace Siege almost always drains them because I don't have a lot of creatures in this deck. Subversion can drain them turn after turn. Same thing goes with Polluted Bonds, where they make their land drop, or Curse of Fool's Wisdom. Painful Quandary can just really mess with them. And then I can drain out them and their board with Pestilence. Same thing goes with Wound Reflection, making all my damage cost a lot more. And then Sanguine Bond and Explicit Blood. Both of these can really close out a game together. And then finally, I have enchantments that give me a ton of advantage. Maybe some of them dealing with card draw, like Phyrexian Arena, Necropotence. Bolas' Citadel is definitely card advantage. I also like the big enchantment Grave Betrayal, stealing their creatures. And then also the Eldest Reborn. Alright, this is my Dao-Chan Artful Beauty deck. It's built around the commander's activated ability, so you can shoot things your opponents have, but then you can protect your own Dao-Chan with really powerful pieces of equipment that give it indestructible, shroud so it can't be targeted, or protection from red so it can't be targeted either. All the other creatures that I have in this deck are pretty disposable. Maybe I'll shoot your creature, this Unbowed Defector, maybe they'll be indestructible, or maybe they'll be getting more relevant creatures out of my deck. Most of this deck is filled with spells that get rid of creatures or even your lands. Sorry, everyone. Maybe I have a lot of recursive value, doubling things up, casting things from the graveyard, or maybe even just casting things straight out of your deck. And then finally, I might win the game with some awesome storm combo. You might also notice this amazing playmat that Dragon Shield had done for me. Freaking awesome. And of course the Street Fighter sleeves that go along with it. Thanks Dragon Shield for that awesome stuff. This is my Cesaia Orochi Ascendant big mana green deck. Cesaia is a pretty normal creature, but if you can reveal your hand and have 7 lands in it, then Cesaia flips. And when it flips, it will just ramp you like crazy, because if you have 5 forests on the battlefield, then when you tap a forest, it taps for 5 green mana. That is a huge explosion of mana. And so what we want to do to enable this is to make sure to get lands into our hands, not necessarily the battlefield. Nylea's Intervention is solid. We can storm lands into our hands with Sprouting Vines. Nissa's Pilgrimage gets a ton of lands into our hand. Rite of Spring lets us cash in actually relevant spells for lands. And then Seek the Horizon can get some lands into our hand. It's really interesting that the best cards don't put the lands on the battlefield, but into your hand. Of course, we have other enablers too. We could double our mana with things like Vernal Bloom and Nissa that doubles mana. And as long as we have forests that create a ton of mana, we can untap them and produce even more with Magus of the Candelabra and Candelabra of Tawnos. Now, once we get crazy amounts of mana, and I really do mean crazy, what are we going to do with it? Well, we can have creatures with activated abilities like Biogenic Ooze. We can Genesis Wave our entire deck onto the battlefield. We can just win with Helix Pinnacle in a single turn, or we can have creatures already on the battlefield that have great activated abilities like Hydra Broodmaster. One of my favorite parts about this deck, though, is that I've been collecting altered cards for a really long time, and every single forest in this deck is altered, and it's something that I really like to sort of show off in my deck. In fact, there's just a bunch of different forests in here. All right, this is my Neuendar Royal Shaper deck. This is a spell slinger deck. It's full of tons of little cantrips and ways to control the game. And then the way I take over the game is by playing some creatures like Monastery Mentor or Talran to generate me tokens, or generate bigger tokens with cards like Metallurgic Summonings or Shark Typhoon. And then I can put a bunch of counters on lands to sort of take over the game. And one thing that's great is that I can affect the board without affecting my land creatures, because there's so many different effects that can bounce or remove every non-land permanent, which means my big creatures remain while wiping away my opponent's board. Garna the Blood Flame is my Rakdos deck because it gives me tons and tons of value. I have bunches of ways to put creatures into the graveyard, and if I want a little bit of advantage, Garna can get them right back into my hand. I particularly like sneak attacking big things into play, and then when they die, I can Garna them back to my hand so I can sneak attack them again. Of course, if things end up in my graveyard, that's just fine because I have a whole suite of cards designed to bring things out of the graveyard. Either a single card with the Reanimate, something over and over again with Felden, or even casting them. I know, full casting? Come on, I'd rather cheat everything into play with Living Death. Shalai Voice of Plenty is my aggro combo Sylasnia deck. Shalai works really well because she gives hexproof to all of my combo enablers. Devoted Druid and Vizier of Remedies gives me infinite mana. Shalai also has an infinite mana outlet built in that can turn small creatures into beaters. I can also make my creatures infinitely big and gain infinite life with Archangel of Thune and Spike Feeder. Life gain also works really well with Walking Ballista and the new Heliod Suncrowned, classic 2-card combo. I can also combo out with a lot of sacrifice enablers. So anything that can sacrifice can create sort of a loop with Sun Titan and Fiend Hunter. Same thing goes with some of the persist creatures out there like Kitchen Finks and Woodfall Primus. There are loops that involve them. You can also use loops that involve cards like Revelark and Karmic Guide. Those work really well together. And then also Renegade Rallier and Safi Erikstadr. All of these and many different combinations can come together and go infinite. There's a lot of overlap between some of these different cards. And here's another product that I like to have around. I want to thank Cool Stuff Inc. They're the sponsor of the Jumbo Commander YouTube channel, and one product that they have is these Commander decks, and they're $15. And that is a crazy price for a Commander deck. It's really difficult to put together $15 Commander decks. And so, granted, a lot of these decks are filled with bulk, and so most of you watching this, you know, probably won't want these Commander decks. But some of you might. And the reason why is because I have some young cousins and some younger people that kind of want to play Magic, and I want to basically have them play with a deck that they might enjoy, but also one that is a little bit easier and one that I'm okay literally giving away to them. And so I love having these decks around because if I find out that some kid really likes Magic, then I'm totally fine with just saying, here, take the deck. It's yours. And that's a really fun and powerful thing to have in your collection. So some of you might be looking for just a small gift and you don't want to spend $45 on a Commander deck for a 12-year-old. I really think that $15 is a really nice gift, and there's tons of them on the website. So this is a really narrow product, but maybe one of you out there thinks that it's perfect for you. And so if it is, awesome. And then thanks to Cool Stuff Inc. because they sponsor me, so that's awesome. All right, this is my Progenitus protection deck. It's so chromatic. Progenitus is a big creature that has protection from everything, and so every creature in here has some sort of protection. These are some of my favorites. Sabu Tabak has protection from legends. We got protection from humans, protection from weird numbers, protection from players in multiplayer. That's very cool. Protection from creatures, instants. Hex Drinker can get up to everything too. It's like my little mini Progenitus. The swords are really good in this deck. I like this new sword because I can choose what color to give protection from. I like Washout because it's removal that targets a color specifically. And Veil of Autumn, again, a card draw sort of removal, targets colors specifically. And that's why my card draw and interaction is so limited, because I still want it to be chromatic in some way. I've included all these other cards because I use them as cantrips. They all have protection from a color, but they all cycle. So literally, like, I'm just cycling them through to get to the better cards in my deck. And I love those little cantrips. All right, this is my Curie, Lineslinger, and Timna the Weaver deck. It's an aggressive artifact deck. I've done a lot of work to it and I love tinkering with it. In its current iteration, it definitely attacks really well. I like Ember Cleave, and of course Cranioplating is always really strong in this deck. 4 mana Karn can create these Karnstructs that can slam in for tons of damage, and Steel Overseer can pump my entire team. But of course there's a whole combo element when the aggro fails. I can sacrifice my board with Arcbound Ravager, and if Marionette Master's on the battlefield, it can drain my opponents out. Marionette Master with Cranioplating on it is also just disgusting. Duretti and Scrap Trawler contribute to my recursive theme, so I can create these artifact engines to just grind my opponents out. These are also some of my favorite sleeves. Thanks, Dragon Shield. All right, what you see in front of you is my competitive Momir Vig Hackball CEDH deck. Momir Vig's a really interesting commander because whenever you play a green spell, you can tutor a creature to the top of your library, and whenever you play a blue creature spell, you can draw a card. Which means that if you can change the text of Momir Vig with some of these spells you see in front of you, which honestly might not be very familiar to look at, well, you can kind of create this engine where you play elves and continue to draw them over and over and over again and cascade into a crazy elf machine. Now, here are elves that you mostly see in elf decks, but just imagine being able to tutor out all the most relevant elves at the exact right time and then just combo out like crazy. That's what this deck is all about. And every other piece in there is disruption and interaction and counter spells. And it's not the most tuned CEDH deck, but it's designed to be super competitive. Okay, Zodahedron Grinder is a really unique effect on a commander. Basically, anything that targets a single creature and you have Zod on the battlefield will multiply out over all of your creatures, which means little things like, I don't know, this card, which basically says target creature gains haste until end of turn, you draw a card, gets copied for every single token you have, meaning they'll all gain haste and you'll draw a bajillion cards. So almost every single mana card that has you drawing a card will be super useful in this deck. There's other things that target, for example, this gives everything +1/+0, and when they die, they turn into Eldrazi. Invigorated Rampage is like a huge boost, giving something +4/+0 and Trample. Just imagine that antheming across your entire board. And we're going to make sure to have a huge battlefield with cards like Goblin Rabblemaster, Hordeling Outburst, Young Pyromancer. All of these will put tons of creatures on the battlefield. You can go a goblin build of this, but I've just gone generic tokens because I'm going for the most efficient tokens possible. And there's tons of ways to draw huge amounts of cards, but then also keep going with awesome mana ramp. Ruby Medallion is really good because it can reduce the casting cost by 1. Even though there's a lot of cheap things in this deck, sometimes you're storming out in a single turn. Treasonous Ogre lets us turn life into mana, and Battle Rage or Battle Hymn will give us a ton of mana because we're going to be flooding the board with tokens and then making them huge with weird red cantrips and pump effects. This is my Moldrotha lands deck. It's based around getting lands into the graveyard and out of the graveyard. All of these can pull 1 or more lands out of the graveyard. But of course, we need to get them into the graveyard as well. So I can wheel them into the graveyard. I can sacrifice them to get into the graveyard. I can sacrifice them and draw cards to get them into the graveyard. I have some spells that sacrifice lands to get more of them. And I have cycling lands that can send them into the graveyard. But of course, if I'm moving lands around, I want to get value every time I do it. The Gitrog monster has me drawing cards, but other effects happen as well. So for example, I could draw a card and gain a life. I can drain you. I can create elementals. I can create zombies, and I can create even more mana. Next, let's talk about one of my unmanders. It's the Grand Calculatron. When it hits the battlefield, everyone reveals their hand and then they put it into a program, which means that they lay it out and they can only play cards from one side. It's pretty tricky. And then whenever you draw a card, you can place it anywhere in the program. And if you ever get below 5 cards, at the end of your turn, you can draw back up to 5 cards. And so this deck is designed to dump your hand as quickly as possible so that you're drawing 5 cards while other people have awkward things in their hands. Like, I don't know, counter spells, 3 cards in that they can't play. Maybe they have to line up land drops. They have like a 7 drop that they can't get to. It's super duper fun. So how many 0 mana spells do I have? Well, I'm just gonna keep laying out all of the mana rocks possible, even weird ones like Jeweled Amulet. Oh my gosh, that one's great because you can get cards out of your hand and put it underneath the scepter. Being able to cantrip. You know, oftentimes I don't even cantrip in this deck. I just play the rocks out. I just play Walking Ballista for 0 just to get it out of my hand to draw even more cards. But all these artifacts, they don't really do anything until, I make them into servos or thopters. Amazing. There's a whole other dynamic of this deck, which is trapping things in your opponent's hand. And there's a few ways to do that. You can tax them with some of these amazing effects, like having lands enter the battlefield tapped, creatures entering the battlefield tapped, making things cost a little bit more, but you can also trap things in their hand by literally naming the card. If you name the card at the top of their program and they can't cast it, then everything that's stuck behind it is stuck too. You can't just rearrange your hand whenever you want to with the Grand Calculatron. So this is super mean sometimes, but mostly it's just fun servo smashing action and everyone has a good time playing the Grand Calculatron. I know, a very weird one. By the way, some of my favorite sleeves as well on this deck. This is my Rurikthar the Unbowed deck, and it started off as a super budget deck. At one point in time, this was a $15 deck, but then some of the cards got kind of out of control, so instead of keeping it to $15, as I upgraded it, I made sure that I was only including cards that cost $1 or less in this deck. And so over time, it's actually grown into something super duper powerful. I think a lot of the power has to do with some of the interesting ways I have to tutor and some of the great targets I have to tutor. So like Endrace Forerunners, Pathbreaker Ibex, you know, Stalking Vengeance, Molten Primordial, you know, Terastodon, Whip-Tongue Hydra. You know, all of these creatures can be played really quickly in this deck because there's a lot of ramp, but also they can just come in with a ton of damage. But a lot of the real power in this deck lies in disruption. Rurikthar the Unbowed deals a ton of damage to players when they play non-creature spells. And so I have a ton of different ways to sort of punish those types of spells. I have Manglehorn, Acidic Slime, Hammer Mage, all of these sort of smash artifacts and enchantments. Viashino Heretic, Molder Slug just starts eating up artifacts every single turn. Bane of Progress is super impactful in this deck. And then I have some other big things that punish expensive mana bases and artifacts. Shatterstorm, Wave of Vitriol, and From the Ashes. So Rurikthar is going to just keep swinging in. I have big creatures to close out the game, but also ways to disrupt a lot more powerful decks than mine. All right, this is my Kenrith the Returned King Politics deck. Every single card in this deck will give something to my opponents or take something directly from them. So Vivictus Asmati can take out a great permanent, but it's definitely going to give them something. Varchild gives people survivals. Skullwinder lets them get something back from their graveyard. Same thing with Scheming Symmetry. Guided Passage lets someone else pick the cards that I tutor for. In fact, if we're talking about tutors, I also have Wishclaw Talisman, which lets them tutor as well. Fractured Identity is political, destroying something but giving it to all my other opponents. I have Fact or Fiction, but more interestingly, I have Little Fact or Fiction Half-Truths guy, which lets my opponents choose which cards I'm getting. Same thing goes with the newer Allure of the Unknown. I'm actually letting them cast a spell, but I get some in return. And then Sphinx of Enlightenment is a great Sphinx that lets me card draw, but I am giving cards away to my opponents. So everything in here is a a decision, I can make a friend, I can make enemies. It's just a really fun political deck to bust out at any commander table. This is my Athreos Shadowborn Apostle deck. Shadowborn Apostles are these 1-mana 1/1s, but if you get 6 of them, you can sacrifice them to search through your deck for any demon and put it into play. And we've had some pretty powerful demons in recent sets. They can take over a game on their own. But when you have a deck filled with 1-mana 1/1s, you definitely need some synergy cards working with it. I like draining my opponents when I sacrifice my Shadowborn Apostles or changing them in for cards, but most importantly is creating an engine where I can pull them out of the graveyard or play them for free or for life. But mainly this deck is just all about the Shadowborn Apostles, and I think I'm running close to 30 of them in this deck. So yeah, it's a fun one. This is my Will and Rowan Kenrith deck. They're partner commanders and they work really well together, but really what you're doing is pushing toward their ultimate. And I'm not taking full advantage of all of their abilities because this is a Planeswalker deck. In fact, I've saturated it with Planeswalkers that create creatures. All of these Planeswalkers create creatures in some sort of way. I'd like to point out the Chandra that gets all my other Chandras bigger because I have a lot of Chandras in there. I also have Saheeli that's going to trigger off of all the Planeswalkers, but the most cool one is Sarkhan, being able to turn all my Planeswalkers into dragons and hopefully take someone out. What I'm gonna do with all of those creatures is polymorph them into better creatures. All of these spells you see in front of you can turn a token that has been created by a Planeswalker or a land that I can activate and turn it into a real creature out of my deck. So what creatures do I have in my deck? Well, I only have 3 of them, and the first one is Spark Double to double up a Planeswalker. Flux Channeler to be able to proliferate my Planeswalkers even more, and Deep Glow Skate, which is basically the ultimate Planeswalker on a dude. So I'm not cheating things into Eldrazi, I'm cheating things into more value Planeswalker shenanigans. This is my Saskia the Unyielding Legends Matter deck. Captain Cesaia means Legends Matter because I can search up any relevant creature I want out of my deck, and Arvad the Cursed pumps them because there is a lot of combat going on in this. You know, Semut gives things haste, Bruised Tarl can make things super powerful, same thing with Xenagos. I also like the ability for Miri Weatherlight Duelist to impact combat. And of course, Timna the Weaver letting me get some card draw in as well. But there's a whole other side of this deck that all deals with creature recursion. Carador lets me cast creatures from my graveyard. Same thing with Kethis. Ravos Soul Tender is combat based because it pumps, but also gets things back from the graveyard. Marin of Clan Nel Toth also gets things back from the graveyard. I'm also really excited about Nethroi Apex of Death because that's another card that can get a ton of stuff back from the graveyard. Granted, there are a lot of humans in this deck, but I really like the idea of pulling a bunch of stuff out of the graveyard. This is my Sig River Cutthroat deck. It's all about getting Sig's trigger and getting in for damage. Basically, I have to deal 3 damage to an opponent, and if I do, I get to draw a card. So I want some evasive things that give me value, like Thada Adel lets me cast their artifacts. Fallen Shinobi, this is amazing because I get to cast their spells. But really, as long as I can just make sure I get damage in, this is a loyal subordinate. It almost always is going to be able to get 3 damage in. Then I'm super duper happy. Of course, I would like to get 3 damage in on my opponent's turns as well, because anytime they lose life, I get to draw that card. And so even enchanting a player to have them sack a creature or lose life is great. Undermine countering a spell, having them lose that life is really solid. Or having them reselect their attack with a card like Portal Mage could have an opponent of mine losing 3 life. Of course, I could also incentivize attacking other people by the Monarch mechanic. I really like Custody Lich because if the Monarch gets passed around, I can keep my opponents sacrificing creatures and then keep the Monarch to myself. Keeper of the Keys is also really great because if I do happen to keep the Monarch, then all my creatures are unblockable and I have a lot of creatures coming in for damage. Okay, so this is one of my oldest decks. It's my Jazon Tamar deck, and I love this old goofy creature. But I've since updated Jazon Tamar because I realized that this deck had a critical mass of enchantments in it, and so I thought it'd be fun to make an Enchantress Jazon Tamar deck. So cards like Perforos, already amazing this deck, become crazy. Divine Intervention, turning all these tokens into angels, is insane. And then of course we have some other things that contribute really well. Archon of Sun's Grace, Mobilization, making creatures, Sigil of Empty Throne, making even more creatures. But really this is a mana hungry deck, and so we have things like Legion's Landing and Burgeoning, Mirari's Wake, all of these giving us tons of mana. Perilous Forays is really great in this deck because it's a sacrifice outlet and mana ramp. Jazon Tamar puts so many Sand Warrior creature tokens on the battlefield based on how many lands you have. But if Jazon dies, the Sand Warriors leave as well. But because there's a delayed trigger involved, you need to sacrifice Jazon Tamar before your warriors come out so that you can keep them. So sacrifice outlets like Perilous Forays is really important, along with cards like, you know, Goblin Bombardment. Get rid of your Jazon, which is problematic, but also weaponize those soldiers, or angels, or, you know, life-linking vampires. You know, sacrificing is also so important. I also make sure to have a lot of really powerful lands complement this deck as well. This is my Grimlock Dinobot Leader deck. Now, this card might not be familiar to you. Grimlock Dinobot Leader is 1 red, green, white for a 4/4 legendary artifact creature Autobot. And it says dinosaurs, vehicles, and other, quote, transformers, creatures you control get +2/+0. So it's an anthem for your entire deck if you build it correctly. And you can pay 2 and convert it to the other side, and that gives you Grimlock Ferocious King. It's just an 8/8 trample that lets you switch it back. I almost never switch it because really the anthem is super, super good in this deck because it's everything in it like fits those descriptions. Like we have Transformers, which are essentially flip cards, like Nissa flips, Archangel Avacyn flips, Werewolves flip. You know, we also have vehicles like Sky Sovereign, Council, Flagship. I've even gone out of my way to make sure that almost everything that I have in here fits those restrictions. So like Growing Rights of Itlamok can flip into a land and be some sort of ramp. Same thing goes with stuff like Legion's Landing. I even have some more flip ramp with Cryptolith Fragment and, you know, the Villager. You know, I have some searching up with Thematic Compass. And then even more flip ramp, Uvenvald Captive, Cultivator's Caravan, Fountain of Ichor turns into a dinosaur, Thunderhead Migration requires a dinosaur. So really, everything that I have in here tries to fit the restriction. I mean, even some of the new cycling cards are kind of cantrips in this deck, because I just really want to be able to churn through it and get to what I need, but I need some dinosaurs going on. And dinosaurs really are sort of the bulk of this deck. You know, Zakama and Jisath are just some of the biggest smashing things that you can do. This is my Golos Tireless Pilgrim, 5-color but mostly Esper Top Deck Matters deck. And so I have here a bunch of cards that care about top decks, whether they're odd or draining my opponent or letting me cast them multiple times. Of course, there's a lot of cards in Magic that care about top decks. Sorin draining them, Little Girl creepily setting up my top deck, or just some really powerful static effects that let me cast cards from the top of my library. Or really what I like is setting up the top of my library with cards like Scroll Rack or Sensei's Divining Top. And as long as I'm messing with the top of my library, I want payoffs. Counterbalance is a very mean payoff, but I'd rather have payoffs dealing with cheating things into play. Aminatu's Augury can cheat things into play really well, but I also like Dream Halls and Omniscience. Notice these are also really big spells, so when I flip them off of, you know, Yuriko, the Tiger Shadow, or Sorin, you know, I'm going to be dealing Omniscience levels of damage to someone, although it does kind of mean that if it's on my top deck, it's hard to cast with Bolas' Citadel. Xyrus the Writhing Storm is my newest commander deck, and it can create a ton of snakes when it's on the battlefield and you force your opponents to draw cards. So something like Whirlpool Warrior, or Memory Jar, or Teferi's Puzzle Box, or even Wheel of Fortune can force your opponents to draw cards, and you can make a crazy amount of snakes. There are other things that synergize in this deck with drawing cards, like Psychosis Crawler, or even Ironcrag Pyromancer, or the Locust God. These can match up really well with our wheels. But then also we have a suite of cards that match up with this token generation. If we have a bunch of snakes on the battlefield, Edric can let us draw more cards, and letting our opponents draw cards and giving us more snakes is fine. Azori Claw of Progress can just dump a bunch of +1/+1 counters on our commander, letting us draw more cards. And then finally, we can make our tokens into something a little bit more relevant with Brutaclad. And then finally, if we're wheeling a bunch, it means we're going to want to take careful note of our graveyard. So things like Eternalize can be really good, or effects like Escape, or even just flashback abilities, or just like, hey, let's get it back with an Eternal Witness. So all of this deck seeks to draw so many cards and then get value wherever we can. This is my Ishaitana 4-color counter combat deck. So what it does is it plays around with counters a lot. And if you can put a lot of counters on some creatures and then move them to others, like for example, Forgotten Ancient puts a bunch of counters on it and lets you move the counters to other creatures. Because like Tana would do really well with a lot of counters on it. Same thing goes with the Ozolith or Bioshift. I love Bioshift because it's like a combat trick, so you can just move counters whenever you want. Similarly, Slippery Bogbonder also lets you move counters around, which is so cool. You know, Tana produces a ton of tokens if you can get her power up a lot. I mean, same thing goes with other cards, like Cranko is really similar too. And then similar to Bioshift, we have some really cool combat tricks that can make this really dangerous in combat, like Embercleave. Just imagine if you are putting this on a huge Ashai or putting this on Tana and creating a ton of Saproling tokens. Same thing goes with Berserk, making the power huge, creating tons of tokens, or just killing people out of nowhere. Or the double strike of Boros Charm. I love also making your board indestructible, because you're definitely going to be putting a lot of key creatures onto the battlefield. All right, this is my Ur-Dragon deck, and even though Ur-Dragon is 5 colors, this is mostly a Jund Ur-Dragon deck. And I really like how aggressive it can be because it reduces the casting cost of my dragons. Torian Mauler is the best dragon in this deck, costing only 2 mana. Similarly, let's talk about Grave Sifter, getting stuff back from the graveyard. But really, we can even have a bunch of 3 CMC powerful dragons like Varric's Bladewing or Opportunistic Dragon. I like Rapacious Dragon because it gives me sort of a refund on some of that cost, and costing only 4 mana with a discount is really great. There's also other dragon synergies that can kind of win the game. There's, you know, Kukusho that can take someone out, but I also like the Utvara Hellkite multiplying more and more dragons, or Laughless Dragon Queen. But really what I'm going for is having a bunch of different dragons on the battlefield, like Scourge of Valcast and Dragon Tempest can sort of smash people in the air, but also really drain people out. And of course, a lot of these cards get combined with a classic World Gorger Dragon combo. World Gorger Dragon and some of these powerful enchantments can flicker everything, and if I have just a Scourge of Valcast out, or, you know, any old dragon in this Dragon Tempest out, then we can essentially win the game. I want to thank Dragon Shield. All of my decks are sleeved up in Dragon Shield sleeves. I think they're the best, and other people think so too. They also have really cool playmats. You can see those in the video. I also want to thank Cool Stuff Inc. They're the sponsor of every video on the Jumbo Commander YouTube channel. If you go to their website to buy Commander cards, whatever you want, use the coupon code JUMBO5 for 5% off your order. I also want to thank my patrons. They support me every single day. Thank you so much, patrons, and thank you for watching this video. It makes me happy when you like, you share, you follow me on Twitter, you say something in the comments. So thank you for your engagement. And thanks so much for watching again. Bye-bye.